Welcome everyone. My name is Ann Coleman and I'm thrilled that the day is finally here. Our first tree workshop. Right tree, right place, tree selection and siting. And we have a great speaker, Dr. Jerrold Turney. First, let me tell you about Altadena Heritage. We have long been an advocate of trees in our community, both maintaining existing trees and increasing our tree canopy. Our mission is to raise... Sorry, could I ask you all to mute yourselves?
For some reason, I'm not getting any sound on my computer.
We've long been interested in maintaining and increasing our tree canopy, and our mission is to raise awareness of and preserve our cultural, architectural, historical, and environmental heritage. And part of our environmental heritage is the tree cover in Altadena. Now, with the loss of so many trees, in thousands of acres of trees, and fires still going on near us, it's all the more important to resolve to increase Altadena's tree canopy and canopy elsewhere. We're able to put on these workshops and conduct a tree giveaway through the generous support of Southern California Edison.
Yeah.
Besides the tree workshop and giveaway, we have new pages on our website dedicated to trees, and I'm really excited about these tree pages. I invite you to go to altadenaheritage.org and take a look at our tree pages. Our tree committee has worked hard to plan these workshops and to provide content on these website tree pages. And I want to give a shout out to the tree committee, Janet Castro, Kathy Musial, Kathleen McDonald, Michelle Zach, Mark Goldschmidt, Catherine Gabzi, Val Zavala, Sharon Sand, and me, of course. There is loads of information on our tree pages. I'm especially proud of the work the committee has done in selecting the best trees for Altadena for our giveaway and in providing short descriptions of those trees. Another thing I want to point out on our tree pages is that we have a resources page, and that includes Dr. Turney's list of trees that should not be planted in Altadena and why they shouldn't be planted in Altadena. And that explains why, for example, you won't see on our tree list the California sycamore or any maple tree. And there are several other species that shouldn't be planted that are not on our list. I want to thank also Catherine Cadigan and webmaster Mark Hinson for making the tree pages so beautiful. And while you're on our website, you might want to take advantage of being there and become a member of Altadena Heritage if you aren't already. Now the program today will go something like this. Dr. Turney will speak for about an hour on tree selection and tree siting. We'll then move to a 10-minute exercise in tree siting, which I will lead. And then participants at home can do the exercise along with me. And then we'll return to Dr. Turney for a Q&A, and we'll try doing Q&A by raising our hands. And now I'll explain how that works later. So please keep your audio muted until you're called on to speak. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jerrold Turney. Dr. Turney got his bachelor's degree in botany from Cal State Poly Pomona, and he got a PhD in plant pathology from UC Riverside. He worked for the County of LA. Now let me see where that is. He worked, for the last 20 years, he worked as senior plant biologist and plant pathologist for the County of LA in the Agricultural Commissioner Weights and Measures Department. He retired in January of this year. And before working for the county, he worked at the Arboretum as biologist horticulturalist. And before that, he worked at Huntington Gardens as the camellia curator. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Jerrold Turney.
Okay.
Take it away, Jerry.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. This is my first Zoom meeting. Very exciting. I have a slideshow, a PowerPoint slideshow I'll go to momentarily. That's going to cover most of the trees on the giveaway list, the Altadena Heritage trees. I've added a few trees that are either closely related to the ones on the list, or ones that are just, people can consider. Before I get into the PowerPoint, I'd just like to give you what I usually tell people about tree selection. And I know there's just so many issues that go into it, but what I usually tell people, because I used to get this call all the time when I worked for the Ag Commission, was the first thing you want to decide is, do I want a deciduous tree or an evergreen tree? Do I want a showy tree with a lot of flowers? Do I want just a shade tree that's, and then of course size, how much room do you have in your garden to accommodate the tree you select? Generally speaking, I encourage homeowners to use trees in the 20, 35 foot, 40 foot range. Those usually work well in most home gardens and in suburban landscapes. When you start growing the really big trees, you need a pretty big yard. If you're going to grow, some of the trees on the list, like camphor trees, they need a lot of space. So if you've got a very large lot, maybe half acre, or even up to an acre, or if you've got an estate-sized lot, multiple acres, then of course you can accommodate some very large trees. So remember, big trees cost a lot to prune and maintain compared to a small tree, and big trees make a big mess, and little trees make a little mess. So the small trees work really well as accent trees, or around patios, 15 to 20 foot trees. And you never want to plant large trees very close to a home or pavement. I've always gone by the rule of thumb that you want about 30 feet. And when you're planting a big tree, you want it about 30 feet from your house. Of course, in the workshop, you'll see a lot of very detailed instructions on how close you can get to your home. Small trees, of course, can get pretty close to your home, maybe within 10 feet. But, I've seen so many problems with large trees that are planted 5 feet from the edge of the home. And then eventually you're either cutting down the tree or you're pruning it frequently just to maintain the tree in a smaller size because it's so close to the home. But let's go to our PowerPoint. And then we'll take a look at this. So our first one is Bauhinia variegata. This is one of the trees on your list, the purple orchid tree. It's native to India and China, to about 30 feet. It has a bark that is tan to brown, smooth. Leaves are light green, bilobed, which is one of the nice things. The very interesting thing about this tree is that bilobed leaf. It's very unique. It thins out in late summer, and the flowers are light pink to orchid purple. I've seen these do really well, but I've seen others that don't do well, and I think it's mostly inadequate irrigation when they don't bloom or they don't look nice anymore. When they bloom up, they can be quite showy. They have a flat bean-like seed pod, and we'll take a look at that too as we go through the pictures here. So here's the bilobed leaf. You see this right here? This is the bilobe. And here's your flower. So pink and rather showy. Here's a close-up of the bloom. So this is a very nice tree to about 30 feet. And then the other one that's not on your list is Bauhinia blakeana, the Hong Kong orchid tree from southern China, to about 20 feet. Just a little smaller than the other one, but very similar in the shape of the flower. Of course, it's in the same genus. So of course it's going to have nearly identical flowers. And it blooms from November to March. So this is a winter bloomer, and the other one is too. And so here's the flower. It's a little, slightly different. Of course, it's a different species. And just as, and then this is about what you expect from these trees. This is about a 15 to maybe 20 feet at the most. And this could be pruned out to look a lot nicer than it does. It's in a parking lot. Often parking lot trees don't get a lot of care. They don't, you know, you got a little dead wood in here. You shape this. This is where pruning would greatly enhance the appearance of this particular tree, which is just a light thinning and shaping of the tree. I may talk a little bit more about pruning as we go, but you know, always remember the guidelines for pruning: prune to enhance the natural form, don't wound the trunk, avoid cuts over 2 inches, topping trees. Severe pruning is the worst thing you can do for a tree, so got to get that out to you. And another tree I think was, actually Viminalis is on your list, but Callistemon citrinus, the lemon bottle brush, very similar, from Australia. We grow a lot of Australian trees. They tend to be very drought tolerant. Now this says round-headed, moderate growth to 25 feet. That's a little bigger than you normally see them. They can get that big, but usually only about 15 feet, maybe 20. They have a stringy brown bark, which is kind of attractive. It's a nice feature. Leaves are narrow, 3 inches long. New leaves are bronze. So in the spring, you get that extra color of bronze. The flowers are bright red, 4 inches long, brush-like. Now this one tends to be more upright than compared to Viminalis. So here you see the tree here. It doesn't weep as much as the other. Here's your, you'll see this along the branches, very typical of anything in the Myrtaceae, the myrtle family. And then here's your flowers for the Callistemon citrinus. And here's Viminalis, the weeping bottle brush. So this is one that's on your list, of course, also from Australia. It says to 20 to 40 feet with a 20-foot spread. Well, I think you're not going to get it to 40 feet. It's just, 20 feet is about as big as I ever seen. And I don't think they're going to grow fast enough that you won't easily be able to contain them to the size you want. Trunk dark brown, leaves slender, new growth reddish, as in citrinus, and flowers bright red. Let's take a look at the flowers. You can see the weeping habitat of Viminalis. So this is actually, almost always considered a plus for a tree, this weeping habitat. It depends on what you want. If you want an upright tree, then you should go with citrinus. And here are the long red flowers, really quite showy when in full bloom. And once established, this is a tree that you would probably water once a month, maybe even through the summer, depending on where you live. If you were out farther east in Riverside, you might water it every 2 to 3 weeks in the summer. At the beach, certainly just once a month. Altadena, just how much sun is it getting? What, you have a heavy clay, but these are very drought tolerant trees. When you plant new trees, you got to water them once a week for the first year. And then you transition to a mature watering schedule, which is typically once a month, and then up to every 2 weeks in the summer. I believe this is also on your list, Cassia chinensis, the Chinese pistachio, a native to central and western China, Taiwan, the Philippines. This has always been one of my favorite trees. Deciduous, slow to 40 feet. Again, I rarely ever see them hit 40 feet, more like maybe 30 feet or even 25 feet. Pinnately compound leaves, 10 inches long. You're growing this mostly for the fall color. In the fall, it colors up scarlet, crimson, orange. Unfortunately, the ones I see in Southern California that are like in the LA basin, we're not getting cold enough to get that color. When I see them up in Antelope Valley, they are, in the fall, they are spectacular. They're really nice. And so here's one that's coloring up a little bit. And you can see that's only about a 15 to 20 foot tree. There was one at the Arboretum for years. It never got bigger than about 25 feet. Here's your fruit. And then this is the color you really want out of these trees. So you can see they're really showy in the fall, typically around November, December, but we got to get cold nights to get that color. And so I planted 2 of these at our headquarters when I was with the Ag Commissioner down in Southgate, and they just weren't coloring up in the fall. We weren't getting warm enough. I wouldn't plant this at the beach nowadays. Altadena, it should do pretty good. You get a little colder up there than you get in the rest of the valley, so it should do pretty good. Cercis Canadensis, this is the eastern redbud. I added this as I don't think it's on your list, but if you're looking for a small tree, this is a nice small tree, typically only about 15 feet. And then very showy when it blooms. It can actually be more like a shrub if you let it get multiple trunks. But if you keep a singular trunk, it'll look like a small tree. From North America, Southern Ontario, Canada, South to North Florida. Showy, light, dark magenta flowers. Fastest growing of the red buds and most apt to take tree form. We also have the Western red bud. I don't believe I've added it in, but here is it in bloom. This is a really nice one. You can see this is only about a 15-foot tree. So if you're looking for a little color and as a patio tree or a small accent in your garden, this is an excellent choice. Here's your fruit and your leaves. So it has these thin pods. Small tree, so not much of a mess, but here's the leaf itself. I think in the winter you need to clean these trees out because they have a lot of old seed pods on them and they start looking a little brownish. So it helps them with a little winter cleaning. Catalpa, I don't know if you've considered this one. I think you've considered it. I don't know if you put it on your list. It's a nice tree, to 20 to 30 feet. Again, I think the 30 feet is a little higher than most of the ones I see. It's a hybrid between desert willow and southern catalpa. And so the name is what we call nothogenic. It's a new genus because you cross it with Chalopsis and catalpa, which gives you catalpa. So it's not a real genus, it's a hybrid genus. 4 to 5 inches long. Oh, here it is. The trumpet-shaped flowers, 1 inch long. They're sterile. That's not bad. That's good. You don't want trees that make lots of good seeds. So here it is. Not real showy because it flowers when it's in leaf. Typically, the showiest flowering trees are deciduous or lose all their leaves and then flower, and then they really are showy. So here's a close-up of the flower. Really pretty flower, but a nice tree. And here's a cluster. Agonis flexuosa, I think this is also on your list for your giveaways. Australian willow, it's in the myrtle family. Native to southwest and southwest of Western Australia. Western Australian peppermint, Swan River peppermint, willow myrtle. Because it has a weeping habitat, incredibly drought tolerant, hardy to 27 degrees. We don't freeze much anymore, but it's always a good idea, especially in Altadena, that you're not picking things that can freeze easily. A height to 35 feet. And yeah, I see them up to 30 feet. There's a few at the Arboretum that are at 30 feet. It does look like a willow. It's not a willow, although the common name is Australian willow. Fibrous bark, black and long, and long, narrow, gold leaves. Leaves smell like peppermint and press. So here it is, very weeping habitat. This one, of course, isn't all that big. Here are the flowers. Not particularly showy, but they do bloom. And there's enough of them that it's a little showy. Now, it's really important when you plant even a drought-tolerant tree that you water it once a week for the first year to get it established. And then don't let it go bone dry for months at a time, or it's not going to grow much. If you want to get a good growth rate and get your trees established, you deep water them, especially after 2 or 3 years, they're established, they're growing. You need to continue deep watering them once a month and not let that soil go bone dry. This is also on your list, Tabebuia and impetiginosa. Of course, you listed it under the new genus and species name, or what I should say, species name. I've always known it as Tabebuia impetiginosa. I'm kind of stuck in my ways. If you go looking for this tree at a nursery and you give the new name, they won't know what you're talking about. So ask for the pink trumpet tree or Tabebuia. From Argentina and Brazil to about 30 feet. There are some named varieties that get bigger than that. There's one at the Arboretum that's easily 40 feet. The ones in my front yard are hitting about 25 to 30 feet. Very showy, trumpet-shaped, lavender pink with yellow throat. Flowers in late winter before leaves emerge. This tree is briefly deciduous. So it loses all its leaves, flowers, and then flushes out with new leaves fairly quickly. So it's only deciduous when it's blooming, and that's about a month. It's not like what I call a fully deciduous tree that's going to drop all its leaves in November and December and not leaf out until March. So here it is. This is the one I planted in the back of my lab, and this is what they do. There's other better pictures of it, to tell you the truth, but this is the one I planted. Here are the close-up of the blooms. And you can notice, of course, that there's no leaves on it when it's blooming. Here's one in South Pasadena, and you can see now it's about nearly twice the size of a single-story home. That puts it in the 25 to 30 foot. You can use the size of a home to judge the height of a tree. Homes are about, a single-family home or single-story home is about 15 feet, 12 to 15 feet, and a two-story home is about 25 to 30 feet. And you want your trees to be proportional to your home. It's not a good idea to put a 75-foot tree next to a single, it's just out of proportion. A single-story home, it just doesn't look right. Now you notice this one on the left, this is also a pink trumpet tree, and these are seedlings. And so if you grow seedlings, the actual size is highly variable. So there are dwarf that you can get out of seedlings. Just a quick comment on that. Tabebuia chrysotricha. Now this is a small tree. This is, you know, the sister species to impetiginosa, the golden trumpet tree from Brazil. Small to 25 feet if you have the patience and live long enough to see it hit 25 feet. Rarely have I ever seen them much, you know, much bigger than 20, 15 to 20. Very slow growth, very slow to get established. It's also true of the pink trumpet tree. Don't expect flowers for about 5 years after you plant these. Very showy, deep yellow with red stripe, 3 to 4 inches. Here's one that's in full bloom. They're absolutely spectacular. This one, look at the trunk on this. This is probably a 15 to 20-year-old tree, maybe even 30. But when they bloom, nothing is quite as showy as the golden trumpet tree, except its sister, the pink trumpet tree. So really nice tree. Here's a close-up of the blooms, and here's the fruit and the flower and the foliage. So you will get these long seed pods, and you'll get seed, and it's viable. And you'll get a few coming up. They're not highly invasive, but the seed is viable, and they will come up. I get some coming up in my front yard every year. Erythrina caphra. Now I noticed you listed an Erythrina on your list. It's a hybrid. I wasn't real familiar with it, or maybe that's actually a species too. But so I'm going to go through 3 of our more common Erythrinas. I don't have pictures of the one on your list, but all the Erythrinas are coral trees, and they're very common throughout Southern California. They're from Southeast Africa. Erythrina caphra, for some reason, is the official tree of Los Angeles, unless they've changed their mind since I read about it. Medium to large, semi-deciduous to 30 feet and equal width. Dark scattered prickles along the stems, dark green trifoliate leaves, showy flowers on thick stalks. You won't get flowers if you water these trees in the summer. These trees need to go dry in the summer. If you put them in a lawn and water them all summer, you're likely to get no flowers because your tree won't go dormant. There's an old story about the ones on Pepperdine, and they contacted a professor at Cal Poly and said, "Why are our trees flowering?" He said, "Because you're watering them." They said, "Well, we got to water them." He said, "Well, then you're not getting flowers." Here is caphra's bloom. Here's the bark. It has thorns on the bark or prickles. Here's, you know, the typical shape. They often have they often develop codominant trunks or leaders, and they have a reputation of ripping and falling off. So that's the one thing about Erythrinas is they typically have weak wood. That's why it's important not to fertilize these trees or water them too much because they'll get even weaker wood. Here's one with it, they're totally deciduous, blooming. You can see this one was topped very heavily right here. Not the best way to take care of a tree. So just pointing that out. Here's your trifoliate leaf. Coralloides, Erythrina coralloides is a naked coral tree from eastern Mexico, deciduous to 20, 30 feet, mustard brown trunk, hardy to the mid-20s. That's nice. I always worry about frost and freezing because, you know, you think it doesn't freeze here anymore, and then we'll get a hard freeze about every 10 years. Tubular flowers are adapted for hummingbird pollination. Here is this particular species. It was coralloides. And then there's the typical, you know, kind of large dome shape. This particular one has pronounced prickles on the branches, and here are your leaves. And they're all very similar among all 3 of the species we're going to look at. Crista-galli is a Cockspur coral tree from Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Paraguay. National tree of Argentina. Flowers in the summer from April to October. And this one has a really different flower from the others with this Cockspur. So I'm really kind of unique compared to the other two species. But they're all going to be similar, and the one you have on your list, in terms of size and flowering habit, it's going to be very similar. And here's one, and you can see it has little longer shoots with the flowers, and here's that deeply furrowed bark. This is a nice tree. Cassia leptophylla is also on your list. It's from the Tabebuia, or the pea family, the golden medallion tree from Brazil. It is nearly evergreen, fast growing to 20 to 25 feet and 30 feet wide. It is a very broad tree. I have seen them hit probably 35 feet. So it really, you know, you can make trees bigger than they're supposed to be if you water them a lot and fertilize them a lot, but you can end up with weak wood. Hardy to about 25 degrees, early to midsummer, terminal clusters of 2 to 3 inches. It's a big balls of white, yellow flowers, really spectacular. 1 to 2 foot long bean-like pods, and this is one of the really cool things about this tree is the pods. Now they line Baldwin Avenue in front of the Arboretum, and here's the tree, the Cassia leptophylla, with these big balls of yellow flowers. And every time they flowered along Baldwin, people would start calling, "What's that tree? I want to grow that tree." Really showy flowers. Here's a close-up of the blooms and the bipinnate foliage. I mean, this is once pinnate. I'm sorry, once pinnate, not bipinnate. Here are your seed pods. This can be a little bit of a litter problem. These are pretty big. Anytime you have large seed pods like this, and if you get a lot of them, you're going to get a little more of a litter problem. I included this one. I don't believe it's on your list. Metrosideros excelsa, the New Zealand Christmas tree. It's an interesting tree, native to New Zealand. It's forgotten the family, but most likely it's Merle, basically. Evergreen shrubbery, round-headed to 30 feet, dome-like, leaves covered in white hairs, produces bright red flowers, and there's a cultivar called Aurora that has yellow flowers. So here they are. And they call it the New Zealand Christmas tree because it blooms in the summer, and in New Zealand, that's at Christmas. But here, it blooms in July. So really showy, especially in this particular picture. And these are very old, established trees. These trees maybe 30, 40 years old before you get a tree this size. Here are your close-ups of the blooms, and of course the typical Mutaceae or myrtle family blooms. And the myrtle family, that includes eucalyptus, melaleucas, the callistemons. You can recognize them all by their bloom. Here's the Aurora with the yellow bloom. So, and you have Tipuanu tipu on your list as well as a big tree. I've kind of started with smaller trees and I'm moving into the larger trees. This is from Argentina, Bolivia, southern Brazil. Deciduous to semi-evergreen, which means in a cold winter, you'll lose all your leaves. And if we don't get very cold, you only lose about half the leaves, or maybe, it just depends on how cold. Fast growth to 25 feet, and this will hit 35 to 50 feet. It'll take some time, but 20, 30 years down the road, 40 years, you're gonna have a big tree. Compound leaves, 6 to 12 inches long, and with leaflets, flowers in clusters, orange tinted yellow. Let's take a look at the tree. This is a big tree. This is one story right here. So here's 2 stories at 30 feet. This tree is probably hitting 40 to 50 feet tall. Here you can see it in bloom. So it's pretty showy. It gets a lot of those bright yellow flowers. And here's a close-up of the flowers. So a nice tree. You could probably keep it to 30 feet with fairly consistent pruning on a 3 to 5 year schedule. Jacaranda mimosifolia, that's also on your list, native to Brazil, very common tree in Southern California. Deciduous, but it's deciduous in the spring. And they start to look a little ratty in the spring, and people would call me and ask me if they're dying. I said, no, wait till June, they'll flower, and then they'll regrow all their leaves. So 15 to 30 foot spread, finely cut ferny leaves, drop in late winter, meaning February, March, and then they bloom May to June, lavender blue. I've argued for years with my son. He says they're purple. I say they're blue. I'm right because I'm his dad. Fruit flat round seed capsules. Let's take a look at a couple things. Here's one in full bloom. These do drip. They will drip nectar from the flowers. So when they're in bloom, and if you park under them, you'll get little driplets all over your car. Not that big a price to pay. It's a gorgeous tree. But the thing about blue, of course, is it fades in the landscape. It's not as showy as a red, yellow, or orange, brightly colored flowers. Blue flowers tend to they're not quite as showy. Here's the clusters, and here is your bipinnate leaves right here. So, and then here's your fruit. Now these trees tend to develop, jacarandas tend to develop a lot of water sprouts. Water sprouts are branches that grow vertically off a horizontal branch and act like a separate tree inside the canopy of the tree. They don't respond to apical dominance. They just take off and they disrupt the form of the tree. And so when you're pruning, one of the things you do is remove water sprouts. You don't want to let them get so big that you got a 3 or 4 or even 5-inch trunk branch, or a diameter branch, because then it represents a big chunk of the canopy. So frequently removing the water sprouts from mimosa jacarandas is a very important thing as they're growing. Zelkova serrata, the saw leaf Zelkova. This is one I've added in. It is in the elm family. Deciduous, height 50 to 60 feet, and a width of 45 to 50 feet. So this can be a big tree, very big tree actually. And let me just briefly say that in my world, 15 to 25 feet is a small tree, 25 to 40, 45, that's a medium tree, 45 and up, 50 and up, those are big trees. Leaves are elliptic, green, vase shape. Let's take a look at a few of them. Here's one, nice vase shape. This is really not going to give you any showy color. Elms are not showy trees. They're shade trees, they're green trees. And now these big trees really frame your landscape. They create the space. So very carefully locate your big trees. Like I said, they need to be about 30 feet from a home. Now the other thing you'll notice, these are all in a lawn. These are going to tolerate lawn irrigation, which is twice a week or 3 times a week in the summer. These aren't nearly as big as they're going to eventually get, but here's a whole row of them. They do give you cover in the fall, and that again is going to be dependent on getting some cold weather in the fall. If we don't get good cold winter, you probably won't see this. Now Altadena, you're a little colder than the rest of the valley, so hopefully you'll see color if you choose to grow this tree. This one obviously is not a 50-foot tree. This is probably a 25 to 30-foot tree, and you could maintain it at this size with fairly frequent pruning on a 3 to 5 year schedule. Acrocarpus falcatus, which still to me is Podocarpus gracilior, that I probably spelled this wrong right here. African fern pine from eastern South Africa, Swaziland, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, 50 to 65 feet. But this is a tree that's easily kept at any height you want. They're not fast growers. The leaves are lanceolate to linear, bluish green, silver or gray green. Here's an individual as a street tree. This is probably 30 feet. They're not going to bolt and take off on you. Now, if you let it go, there are 40, 50 years, you might end up with a 45, 50-foot tree, and I see those around. They're not uncommon. Here it is. They have a very thick, dense canopy, excellent for screening on the perimeter of lots. If you don't want to see something like your neighbor's backyard, or you don't want them to see your backyard. They are actually easily hedged too. So this is a common hedging material. They'll take shearing. So you can keep them to like a 15-foot hedge or even a 20-foot hedge if you got a very tall ladder. Here's a close-up of the foliage. The other one that you'll see around is Podocarpus macrophylla. I think it's a little leggy. It's got bigger leaves, and it's not one of my favorites. It'll do okay. Brisbane Box, Lophostemon, Lophostemon confertus, native to Australia. It used to be Tristania conferta, and I always think of it as Tristania because I'm old. Moderate growth to 60 feet. I don't see them hit that size in Southern California really very often. I think of this more like about a 30 to 40 foot tree. They have a rusty brown bark that peels away to show a smoother, lighter bark. That's always a nice feature on trees that have what we call deciduous bark that sloughs. It often gives a color variation on the trunk. Leaves are leathery, flowers in clusters of 3 to 7 in summer, white to cream. So here's one, and you can see this is only about a 30-foot tree. This isn't a giant tree. Here's a 1-story structure in the back. This might be about the size of a 2-story house. Here's the blooms. They're not particularly showy, and your typical capsules you see in anything from the myrtle family, like eucalyptus and Lophostemon. And then there's a variegated form, and this is the variegated form. This is, you know, I always encourage people to go with variegated foliage. Flowers for color in landscape are brief and come and go. But variegated foliage is year-round. So, you know, some people are looking for color in their garden, and flowers are just the harder way to go, especially if you're doing annuals or replanting your color all the time. So variegation is a great way to add color to your landscape without the hassle of constantly replanting or working on trying to keep things blooming. Cedrus deodara, the Deodar Cedar, very common in Altadena. Christmas tree lane, of course, is lined with them, and they're all over the place. It's from Afghanistan, northern Pakistan, and north central India. 40 to 60 feet, and yes, they will hit 60 feet, even 75 feet. But they are tall and columnar. The lower branches will really give you a tremendous spread if you don't remove them. Now, typically, in most landscapes, you don't want your major scaffolds to start below 12 feet. So as you're pruning young trees, you're removing branches that are below 12 feet, not until for a year or two, because you want those side branches to feed the trunk and shade the trunk. And that's another talk about pruning and training young trees. But in a park setting, or like at the Huntington or the Arboretum, you'll see that the lower branches have been left, and they have this sweep, and they'll go out 20 feet, 30 feet. It's really spectacular. Very drought tolerant, but again, water once a week for the first year, maybe every 2 weeks in the spring and the fall, the second and third years, and back to once a week in the summer. But by the third, fourth, fifth year, you should be watering this tree once a month. And just a side comment, you know, years ago, the Public Works asked me to assist them on Christmas tree lane. And those trees now are probably 75, even 100 years old. And a lot of them have oak root rot fungus, but this tree is highly resistant to oak root rot. That makes it a good selection for Altadena because that is extremely common in the San Gabriel Valley. So these trees, often when they hit this age, have a lot of decay under the trunk, and the homeowners are loath to remove them. The county wanted to cut a couple down that had so much decay you could crawl under them and stand up. Almost stand inside the tree. So a high wind event is likely to knock that tree over with that much decay. Now they used to put in 48-inch box trees with a crane and a backhoe to dig the hole, and those trees would be planted and then they would just sit. And they would barely grow for years. They switched to sleeves that are about 2.5 feet tall and about 6, maybe 4 by 4 at the top. You would plant one of those sleeves, and of course they're really inexpensive, and you can plant them with a shovel. And in 2 or 3 years, they would catch up to the 48s. And in 5 years, they would pass them. So this illustrates the point that the smaller the tree you plant, the better tree you end up with. When you go for these big box trees, you got all the problems that tree developed in the nursery, in the root system. And they're often stunting and debilitating problems. So go with small trees. 5s and 15s are excellent choices. You get a better tree if you use a smaller tree. Here's a mature, spectacular Cedrus deodara. And the thing I like about this tree is the top kind of leans over like that. It's just so cool. Occasionally this dies out a little, but this weeping habitat. And this is in a park where they've allowed the lower branches to really extend. So really spectacular. Here's a close-up of the foliage. There's a Pittosporum undulatum underneath it, a little mixed in. here is your female cones and your male cones. So they're both on the same tree. Excuse me. When the male cones open and release their pollen, you can whack the branch. They're going to be on the lower branches, and clouds of yellow pollen come out. The female cones tend to be at the upper branches of the tree. This is typical in cone-bearing trees. The pollen is meant to drift off and pollinate a different tree, not the same tree. They're trying to outcrop. So the pollen, female cones at the top of the tree typically don't get the pollen from the lower branches. They're going to get it from a different tree. So this yellow pollen will often accumulate on deck furniture, on your car. People will wonder what it is. It's just pollen. Wash it off. It's harmless. And it's just brief. It's not a big deal. This is Cinnamomum camphora, the camphor tree, one of our most spectacular large trees, but often planted in inadequate space. I've seen them planted in 2-foot parkways, and it's like, wow, the trunk's going to be 4 feet. So it's in the Lauraceae, the laurel family from China and Japan, 50 to 70 feet, and they will get there. Hardy to 25, they don't freeze here. Leaves have glossy, waxy appearance and smell of camphor when crushed. And in the spring, they are absolutely fluorescent light green. The no foliage is spectacular. And that's when you're going to get most of your leaf drop is in the spring too. It rains leaves under these big trees. Fruit comes in clusters, black berry-like, half-inch, pale bark, very rough, drops leaves heavily in early spring. So here are some that have been planted in a parkway, not a good place to put them. They're going to break the sidewalk, they're going to break the curb, they're going to come in and cut this and repair the sidewalk and the curb and do a large root pruning, and then the tops of the trees are going to die back. That's very common. So give this tree the space it needs. They tend to develop multiple or co-dominant leaders. This one here has bole branching. So as they're growing, avoiding these structural defects is really important. And that's easy to do with a little pair of hand shears or a lopper or a handsaw, removing branches that are co-dominant and developing a central leader, although this is their habit. This is how they like to grow. Here they are in spring. Wow, absolutely spectacular. A little too big for this front yard, underneath power lines. I assume they're power lines, maybe they're telephone lines. So not the best place to put this tree, but absolutely spectacular. And it'll shade that house all day. Here's the fruit and the leaves on the close-up. Now this tree does get a pest that can cause a little bit of a problem. It doesn't kill the tree or really hurt the tree much. It's the Persea mite or the avocado mite. The Lauraceae is also, the avocados are from the laurel family, and they share this pest. And you get little yellow spots all over the leaf, especially along the veins. You flip it over, you see these little yellow spots, shiny spots with this fine webbing, and underneath are these little mites. And eventually you'll get holes all through the leaf. So when I was at the Arboretum one time, a nurseryman came in and brought me all these camphor leaves with holes. And he thought it had shot hole, which is a disease of deciduous fruit trees, of peaches and things like that. And he'd been treating with a fungicide to control a mite, so he didn't get any control. And I said, no, it's a mite. So when they're young and small, say it's only 10 feet, 15 feet, you can dust this with sulfur to control the mites. Or you could use neem oil. And so it's not that hard. Once they get big, you're not going to control the mite, but it's not that important. But when they're young, you should probably try and control the mite. Metrosideros stroboides is not on your list, but I wanted to include it because it's an interesting tree. The dawn redwood, this was believed to be extinct and then found in China. Deciduous, fast growing, they say to 90 feet. The biggest one I've ever seen was probably 40 to 50 feet. Sole living species of the genus, similar to ginkgo. Thought to be extinct, found growing in China in the 40s. Green needles turn bronze in the fall. So this gives you spectacular, this is it during the summer. Here it is in the fall when it colors up. And I actually used to get calls, people thought it died, but I said, no, it's just a deciduous conifer. I believe it is a conifer. Here's your leaves on dawn redwood. Here's the color again. I know this isn't on your list, but I wanted to cover it. Now, here's another tree I wanted to cover briefly. Acer macrophyllum, the big leaf maple. I know the maples are a big problem because of invasive shothole borer. This is a native tree to Southern California, and it grows in Eaton Canyon. It grows in streams, Alaska all the way to Southern California, 30 to 75 feet, which means it has a huge variation in height. And it's just, if you're going to grow a maple, now they don't do real well if they're not growing right in the stream. They don't live that long, but it's an interesting tree. I thought I'd include it. Very resistant to oak root rot. Here it is. So they get big. They get pretty big. Here's a 2-story house. This is significantly taller than a 2-story. This is about a 50-foot tree. Here it is before it colors up. Here are your maple leaves, and here's the winged fruit you typically see on all the maples. Here's its natural distribution from Canada all the way down into Southern California. Now this is a riparian tree, meaning it grows in streams. Acer palmatum, another acer. Again, the invasive shothole borer prefers all the maples, so I said don't plant maples. But if you want to get one of these very small maples, so Acer palmatum, there are probably several hundred named cultivars. Some of them only get about 10 feet, and you can spray them to keep the beetle off, but it's a lot of spraying. But they're so beautiful and they're so wonderful. You go to San Francisco, you see the Japanese maples, and you think it's the most beautiful tree you've ever seen in your life. So airy and delicate, leaves to 2 to 4 inches long, young spring growth is glowing red, fall forward scarlet, orange and yellow. Many, many cultivars. When I was at the Huntington, we bought in 75 different cultivars. So here's a low-growing dome-shaped cultivar. Here's a bigger one. But if you choose to grow any of the maples, you are going to have to deal with invasive shothole borer. Here's some of the color. Here's some of the long, thin leaflets. And so you can see they have beautiful color, really striking. But if you want to grow one of these, beware. The invasive shothole borer is a real problem. And so that's the trees I wanted to cover. I have a bunch of, also have on my tree, on my thing here, on my show, past these slides, most of our native oaks. And I don't want to go to those right now. I want to end the show and just say, again, when you're selecting your tree, think really carefully about it because it defines your landscape. They're going to be there for decades. Most likely the people you sell your house to will have to decide what to do if you pick the wrong tree. And Ann is going to go over, how you avoid these problems of placing your tree in the wrong spot. Don't put it under power lines if it's going to be a big, tall tree. That's just foolish. Don't plant it too close to your house. Don't plant it on top of utilities. All these things need to be taken into consideration. But for most of the people who would contact me about tree selection, I would start going over what do they want out of a tree? What do you want? You want color, you want shade, you want screening. Those are all things you have to take into consideration when selecting your tree. So I've used up most of my first hour here.
Thank you, Jerry. That was great. And we'll take questions after the exercise. And I want to point out that the next tree workshop, October 24th, is on pruning. You talked about pruning a lot and how important it is for defining the structure of the tree, preventing weak limbs, and even keeping the height. We're always told not to top our trees, but you talked about keeping the height down. So there's a good way to keep the height down of a tree. Is that right?
Absolutely. If you think, the ultimate form of pruning or art of pruning is seen in bonsai. And in bonsai, you can have a liquid amber, of course, I don't recommend anymore, only, 16 inches tall because it's pruned every 3 months. And they're just taking little tiny cuts. So if you want to keep a tree smaller than its mature height, it requires a more frequent pruning, but you still should follow all the guidelines, which is avoid cuts over 2 inches, prune to enhance the natural form, don't wound the trunk. Pruning in the right right time of year can be important depending on the species you're talking about. So if you got a 40-foot tree and you only want it to be 25 to 30, you can do that, but you're not taking off 3 feet at a time. You're taking off 6 inches or 12 inches. So small cuts frequently. You're looking at a 2 to 3 year schedule. Maybe once mature and the height you want, maybe every 5 years, depending on growth rate. What kind of tree did you select? How much water is it getting? Water drives the growth of trees. Trees in dry landscapes grow very slowly. Trees that get abundant irrigation or adequate irrigation grow at their natural rate or even above. And is it getting fertilized a lot? And don't fertilize these big mature trees much, because you'll end up with weak wood and dropping branches.
Okay, great, thanks. So we'll be putting out the registration link for workshop number 2, pruning and tree care, which will be led by Jerry. And that is a must-see workshop. I think that is going to be so important for making sure we have trees that look beautiful and that are strong and that we can be proud of and that will stay in the landscape. So now I'd like to take 10 to 12 minutes to do the workshop exercise that we mentioned in our mailings. And those of you who have a site plan on grid paper, you can work along with me. Others you can watch or maybe go get a cup of coffee. We'll be back with Jerry in 10 to 12 minutes, and at which time he'll take questions. So let's get started with the workshop. I'm going to pull up this one. Okay, so here is a plot of my property, or most of it anyway. And so I created grid paper. I hope you can all see this. And what I've indicated here are my property lines. This is the outline here. Okay. And I've indicated my house. Okay, that's the dark black line here. I've indicated paved areas. That's my driveway over here, and that leads to my garage over here. I've indicated my patio here, which is paved, and a small patio here, and walkways. And I've indicated my existing trees. I have 4 in the front yard, and you can see I don't really have space for another tree in the front yard, but I will indicate some of the no plant zones in the front yard. I've indicated my water line coming from the street. That's this thick lavender line here, and my septic system and my sewer pipe, lavender here. And I've indicated some overhead power lines, okay? Now this is not a high voltage line. This is my electric. I have a higher electric line and a lower cable line here. So it's not high voltage, it's 240. And at the bottom here, I've indicated what the no plant zones should be. So for example, a no plant zone, you need to keep large trees 35 feet away from a building, and medium trees 25 feet, and small trees 10 feet, as Jerry mentioned. These numbers come from the Pasadena Cool Trees booklet, which you can link to on our tree resources page on the Altadena Heritage website. Now for fences and paved areas, the no plant zone near fences and paved areas is 5 to 10 feet. So the Pasadena Cool Trees booklet says leave 10 feet, and Tree People says leave 5 feet from paved areas. And as far as overhead power lines, I think this rule is for the high voltage power lines. Large trees should be planted 30 feet away, medium trees 20 feet away, and small trees 10 feet away. So what I'd like people who have grid paper to do is draw lines that are first 10 feet away from your buildings. So I'm going to start doing that. If I can get to an annotate, here we are. And I'm going to choose a dark red line. Just bear with me. Okay, so now here I'm going to draw can you all see that line? I could make it thicker. Let me make that thicker. Okay, so we'll draw that line here. So that's 10 feet. Actually, it's a little bit less than 10 feet from my house. And here's another one that's 10 feet from my house. Okay. We need to leave about 5 feet from the patio. I'm going to draw here. We're going to draw we're going to draw a line at the property line. My house is only about 5 feet from the property line over here. We're going to draw a line that's 10 feet from my house over here. Okay. And we're going to leave about 5 feet from my patio here. Okay. We're going to draw a line 10 feet from my garage. That's another building, and we have to leave 10 feet. And we're going to leave about 5 feet from my driveway. And I'm going to, since I can't draw, I can't draw curved lines very well, I'm going to make it do the best I can with straight lines. So I'm leaving 5 feet from my driveway. And this is all driveway here, so I don't have to indicate that. And now and then we're going to leave 5 feet around our water line and sewer line. I'm going to draw that. Okay. And 10 feet from my overhead power line. That's about here. Okay. Okay. And then what we should do is really shade in these areas. Oh, and I should say also 5 feet, 5 feet from your property line is a no-grow zone. So now we'll fill in most of these no-grow areas, and you could do cross-hatching. I'm going to shade, let's see if I have the right thing here. Yeah, I'm just going to fill that in. So I'm defining my no-grow zones here. So, or no plants, no plant zones. Okay, growing is okay, planting not okay. This here. Sorry, wrong tool.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
How far from water lines and sewer lines?
Well, the Pasadena Cool Trees book says 5 feet.
Okay, thank you.
5 feet clear. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I have electrical conduit here. So I'm going to shade in 5 feet around that one here. Okay. So what I have here, I have not trees, but shrubs. These little green ovals are shrubs. So let's see, have I left anything out? I'm not going to color in this overhead 10 feet near this overhead power line because I don't think I really need, Jerry may correct me on this, but I don't think I really need to stay that far away since it's not a high voltage line and the lower line is a cable line. And I'm not going to color in the 5 feet near my water line and my septic tank. You can just, because we're not, to save time. And also you could see that my trees already violate the rules in my front yard somehow. And that's because the walkway and the septic tank were put in after the trees were already growing there. So that's, I'm getting away with breaking a lot of rules over here. And this tree over here, I don't know if you can see me pointing to it. This tree over here at the top left of my house, I planted that one. That's a small pineapple guava. And I see that I'm barely within the rules of that tree. I'm 10 feet from the house, so I just barely made it, and it is a small tree. But anyway, if we look over here, here's a space I have open for planting a tree. Okay, so I can choose to plant 1 or 2 trees, and let's try 1 tree. Well, let's try 2 trees, sorry. We can maybe plant a little tree there. Let's see, sorry, I want to fill that in. Plant a little tree there. And maybe a tree here. But that looks kind of crowded. And here, the trees, when I draw canopies, they'll be growing into each other. But it's a possibility. But I'm going to choose instead to plant 1 tree. I'm going to delete those. And I'm going to move this one over here. And I'm going to try it out here. So I'll draw a canopy. Let's see, make that a round canopy and move it. And so now I'll check to see whether the tree I've decided to plant could be a large or a medium or a small, okay? I've left 5 feet from the patio. I've left 10 feet from my house. So if I look at the distance from the trunk to the patio, I'm about 13 feet away from the patio. That's okay. I need to be 5 to 10 feet away. How far am I from the garage? I'm about maybe 15, 18 feet from the garage. So that puts me in the building range. I should be planting a small tree or maybe a well-behaved medium tree, maybe with roots that are not invasive and a narrower canopy. How close am I to my house? Well, this is the closest corner of my house to this tree. And here again, I'm about maybe 20 feet, okay? So it looks like, and to the driveway, I'm about 12 feet from the driveway. So I'm okay with paved areas. So a tree is okay there, but it looks like I'm really safe with a small tree. And I could possibly plant a medium tree. What do you think, Jerry? Do you have any opinion? Jerry, can you unmute yourself? Lower left corner. Okay. Okay, so do you think?
Anyway, yes, you're right. You need a small or medium-sized tree in that spot. What's the orientation on your yard? Where does the sun rise?
Sort of where sun rises over down at the bottom, and north is sort of pointing out the upper corner of the garage. So this is generally east of my house. East, is it garage? Sort of northeast of my house. So it's not great for shading the house. I know it's not great for shading the house. But I want to have a tree because I want to help combat the urban heat island effect. I want the cooling effect of the tree. And I might want some shade on the patio if I sit out there in the mornings.
Well, again, now you go back, you want a medium tree or a small tree. Now you want color. You want just a broad dome for shade. I mean, that'd be a nice spot for a pink trumpet tree. That would be about the right size. If you want color, if you just want drought tolerant tree for shade, you go with Agonis flexuosa. Very mellow, very thin, not a real shady tree. But yeah, I'd be looking at something in the 25 to 35 foot height range. and then decide whether you want deciduous, flowering, shade, that kind of thing.
Right, okay. And oh, I forgot to mention this overhead power line. I'm still about 10 feet from the overhead power line, but if I wanted like an umbrella type of tree, could I have a tree with a wider canopy and come right up to my cable line, for example? Would that work, Jerry?
Yeah, you don't want those branches to get up into the power line, but if they're just short of, especially if it's a low cable line, that the danger with the trees in the really high power lines is that if someone's up there pruning it, it'll arc, and they can be electrocuted, or the branch can catch fire. So you don't want trees growing up into power lines. So if you can keep it, the canopy, 5 feet short or 3 feet short of the lines, especially the lower lines aren't likely to arc or light people on fire. But every year you hear somebody put a pole saw into a power line and someone gets electrocuted. It happens every year. And people talk about it, we constantly talk about it. But people make mistakes.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to turn it back. I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and I'm going to ask people to raise their hand to ask a question. So what you need to do to raise your hand is click on the participants icon down at the bottom of your screen. And then you'll see a window that has participants at the top. And at the bottom, you have little buttons that say invite, mute me, raise hand. Okay, so click on that raise hand if you want to ask a question, and we'll call on you to ask your question of Jerry.
There is one question here already from Gregory Reddy. What are your thoughts on California natives? I think natives are great. They're challenged a little bit, which is kind of unusual. But the problem with California natives is a root disease called Phytophthora root rot. And this has become a really hot button issue in the nursery industry and in conservation of natural spaces. So California natives, especially here in Southern California, evolved in an extremely dry climate, and they have no resistance to Phytophthora. Phytophthora is a water mold. It infects the roots, and then it makes swimming spores, and the soil stays wet, or if it's watered a lot, then it starts killing all the roots, and the trees decline or they die. There's about 100 species of Phytophthora. Some of them are really famous. I could talk for hours on Phytophthora. But our California natives have a very high susceptibility, and often once they get infected, they die quickly. So it's not unusual when I see a new California native garden go in, that if you come back in 6 months, half the plants are dead, and they died from Phytophthora. And they got infected in production, in nursery production. And I don't know if they treated to keep them alive. Now, this is something that's a little, people argue or debate this. I recommend that people, when planting native plant nurseries, treat for Phytophthora root rot for the first year. Then, hopefully they've started to grow some roots and you don't need to water them once a week. So once you get your natives established, after a year, then you're watering them once a month, maybe just in the spring. Now they can look a little ratty in the summer if they go bone dry. But if you're growing ceanothus or archistaphyllus or mimulus, there's so many natives you can choose from, they all tend to just crash and die from Phytophthora. And part of this is that in some of these open spaces over the last 5 to 10 years, I forget the whole timeline, up in the Bay Area, up in Northern California, they went in and replanted these areas to reclaim them or restore them, and they put in all these natives, hundreds and thousands of plants planted, and then they started dying left and right. So they went out and picked the dead ones and figured out it was Phytophthora root rot. And then they spent $1 million trying to deal with the Phytophthora in these native natural areas. This became really a big issue. people were saying the ag commissioners aren't enforcing cleanliness standards in nurseries, but it's extremely hard. You can't see Phytophthora walking down a nursery row because if the plant dies, they throw it in the trash. So how do we find Phytophthora in a nursery? It ain't easy. The Forest Service has become extremely cautious about replanting in the national forest unless you can prove the plants aren't infected. So that's what, for California natives, love them, they're great, but know that they can be hard to get established and they can die quickly. When I was at the Huntington, we plant natives and in a year they're dead because that's an old garden and Phytophthora has been introduced into it repeatedly over many, many, many decades. And now it's just a challenge to grow things that have, high susceptibility to Phytophthora. So that's the only caveat to have for natives. And of course, some of our natives, especially the chaparral natives, they really are meant to burn fairly frequently, 25, 30 years, 40-year, burn cycles, and that actually controls a lot of their diseases. So when you get like manzanita, if you want to grow manzanita, I see a lot of the manzanitas that hit 20, 30 years old, and they've got these Bauhinia cankers. Up in the mountains, that burns up and it kills it, and then they resprout from the base. And it's a bit of a challenge. That's another challenge is bot canker on some of the woody natives. There's not a lot you can do about it. I've seen it everywhere at Claremont, and the beach, and of course you go up in the mountains, you can see it. Anyway, and then the other question was why we didn't cover oaks. And in the early discussion, of course, I wasn't involved in picking the trees you guys are giving away, but there was a consensus that you didn't need to give away any more oaks because Altadena has a very high population of native oaks, particularly California coastline oak, and perhaps Engelmann oak. I don't know what else other oaks you grow. I am a big supporter of growing oaks. Early on with the invasive shothole borer, Ulacea, of course, all the oaks are on the host list. I'm not recommending you don't plant oaks because of Ulacea or invasive shothole borer, whereas in Western sycamore is such a good host. I would not plant a Western sycamore myself because of the shothole borer. But I would still plant California coastline oak, Engelmann oak, or some of the really cool other oaks that aren't naturally occurring in Pasadena or San Gabriel Valley, but the Oregon blue oak, the valley oak, maybe the Quercus chrysolepis, and I have all those as a lecture on oaks, and they're actually on that slideshow. If we have time at the end, I could run through a few, but oaks are great. And the California coastline oak is, of course, one of the easiest oaks to acquire at any nursery. I mean, they're really common. And then for some of the more unusual oaks that, you're probably gonna have to go to Theodore Payne or out to Claremont to Rancho Santa Ana to get the, maybe, the blue oak, even Engelmann oak. I don't know how many people grow Engelmann oak, Quercus Engelmannia. So, but that's a wonderful oak. And they do naturally occur in the San Gabriel Valley. There's a natural, say, small forest of them at the Arboretum. And they occur there naturally, but they weren't planted. Nice oak, Engelmann oak.
Could I interject that in Altadena is unincorporated county, and that if you do plant an oak, you should be aware that anytime you apply for a building permit, you have to put on the permit whether are any oaks on your property and oaks on your neighbor's properties, and whether your building project will impact the root zone of any oak tree. And the root zone is defined as any area within 5 feet on the outside of the canopy. So it's a large root zone, and the building permits are expensive. It's about $1,000 if one oak tree is involved, and about $8,000 to $900 if more than one oak tree is impacted by your building project. So people should be aware of that. The oak tree protection laws are pretty draconian.
They're very strict.
In the county, yes.
In the county, very strict, and they're strict in some other communities too. We have 88 cities in Los Angeles County. Some people think oaks are protected on a statewide basis. They're not. They're protected by local ordinance only. Yes. So if you're in an unincorporated county, or if you're in San Marino, they protect all trees over 4 inches. at breast height. South Pasadena protects all trees at 4 inches above breast height. So I can see that people are cautious about planting protected species.
So,
Now, if you're never planning on building anything on your lot, then that's not an issue for you.
okay. So we have a question from Joy Walters. Joy, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
There. Okay. I do have a native plant garden, and I want to kind of stay with that, but I'd like to have something that would blend in with the chaparral look. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Well, do you want natives? More natives? You know, you want a big tree, a little tree, you know?
Well, a small to medium. I already have 2 Western redbuds, Toyon, and I have some, I didn't plant them, but somebody planted a couple of cedars in my yard. So I don't know what they're.
Well, there's a lot of wonderful, you could consider, if you're just looking for a small to medium tree, you might consider California buckeye. That's a nice small tree, California native.
Yeah.
If you don't want a native, you want just something very drought tolerant, it's, I often talk about this, you don't mix plants that have different watering needs together.
Right.
You don't put cactus and fuchsias next to each other. And generally, you don't want your big trees to be in a lawn because their watering requirements are virtually opposite. Trees are watered infrequently and deep, and lawns are watered frequently and shallow. You don't mix them together. Anyway,
Right.
So another good tree would be Jerusalem thorn, or the Mexican palo verde. That's the common name. It's what is that one?
The green trunk one.
Green trunk.
Okay.
It is a host for invasive shot-hole borer, but it's not a great host. If you're looking at all these, everyone should be aware of invasive shot-hole borer. And now that started back, maybe 10 years ago or so. And it was first found on avocado. There's a little tiny beetle about the size of a grain of rice. It burrows into the trunk, infects the tree with a fusarium, which is a fungus. Then the larvae hatch out and eat the fungus. They come out, they're all female, they're all mated with their single brother from the gallery. They walk down the tree and burrow into this beetle kills trees. It really kills maples efficiently. It kills the western sycamore and the London plane tree. Those are both sycamores. So that Jerusalem thorn is a host, so I would just caution you on that. Maybe I'd have to, a lot of times when people ask me about trees, I have to think for a minute and think about some of the other trees. If you want a slightly taller columnar tree, you might go for what is the Catalina ironwood.
Oh.
That's a nice native tree. Not the easiest tree to find. Every time I'm looking for it, I'll call up a nursery. They might have 5. And then they'll say, oh, by the way, they're all sold. Like, great. But anyway, I was able to get a few for a client of mine a few years ago, but they're not widely grown. That's another thing. If you pick a really unusual tree, you may be hunting for a nursery that grows it.
Yeah.
Or if you pick all the standard stuff that everyone grows, well, every nursery I've walked in has Magnolia grandiflora, the southern magnolia. Wonderful tree, maybe not the best selection going forward in Southern California with our water restrictions. It does need adequate, water on a regular basis, but a nice tree. And then you see the ones that aren't getting enough water, and they do suffer. They don't do that. So, and of course, maybe one of the oaks. You don't have an oak in your front yard. Some of the other oaks don't get quite as big. Maybe one of the golden oaks or one of the shrub oaks might fit into your garden well too.
Yeah, I've got a driveway that I have to consider on my neighbor's side. So yeah, that's the issue, a problem I have to think about.
I'll just say before we go to the next question, I have a question from Michael Zach. Would I recommend a fruitless olive tree as a good medium tree? The answer is no. I would not recommend any olives at this time because they are a host for bacterial leaf storage caused by Xylella fastidiosa. Xylella fastidiosa infects right now 5 different common trees, and 1 shrub, I should say. So liquid amber, absolutely don't plant that. Purple leaf plum. I still go with fruiting plums because plums are not long-lived trees, but those purple leaf plums the red plums and the flowering plums, boy, they die quickly from this, very quickly. And then crepe myrtle is the host, and an oleander, and I've left one on olive. So I see olives dying now all through the San Gabriel Valley. I first saw olives dying in 2001 at the Adams House State Park in Malibu. And they had these huge old olives that were probably 100 years old, and they were all leafless and dead, and wanted to know how to save them. Well, it was too late. I collected samples from all their infected trees. There was a little foliage on a few of them. Out of the 12 samples, 7 came back positive for Xylella. This started in the 1890s on grape. It was known then as grape mystery disease or Enheim disease. Newton Pierce worked on it. It became known as Pierce's disease of grape. He thought it was a virus. In the 1940s, during the war, when antibiotics came out, they treated grapes, saw remission. That indicated it was most likely a bacterial disease. It was not until 1979 that the bacteria was cultured, and it was proved that the disease was caused by Xylella. It is vectored by leafhoppers, the glassy-winged sharpshooter, various sharpshooters. All the sharpshooters are leafhoppers. So we've got the glassy-winged sharpshooter, which is introduced into California from the southern United States, discovered in 1990 here. At the same time, oleanders were found suddenly dying in the Riverside County, quickly spread to the rest of Southern California. Now oleanders are dying everywhere. Liquid ambers are dying everywhere. Olives are dying everywhere. So no, I wouldn't grow any olives right now. And it's just not, in 10 years, your tree could easily be dead. So, and once you see the symptoms, now in olive, the symptoms of the tips of the leaves turn brown. Then you'll notice dead branches in the canopy, and slowly over time, after another 3 months, 6 months, another branch is defoliated and died. And after about 5 years, the whole tree dies. You can inject them with antibiotics, but you have to do it every spring. I don't know that it really is going to keep your tree alive a whole lot longer. Maybe. The people who sell that, of course, want to promote it, but I think it's not sustainable, it's expensive, and you'd be better off removing your infected tree, replanting with a tree that doesn't have a disease problem currently, and spending your money on a new tree rather than trying to save a tree that's hopeless. So no olives.
So can we take a question now from Gregory Reddy? Gregory, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Yes. I was just wondering if Jerrold is going to share his presentation.
I'm sorry?
Will you be sending around your helpful presentation you gave on the list of trees?
We've recorded this, Gregory, workshop, and it'll be posted on YouTube, and we'll have a link to that on the Altadena Heritage website.
Oh, great. Thank you. So that, since I have you, may I also ask about fruit trees? Citrus seems to do well in Pasadena, guava trees. Any thoughts on fruit trees? And
well, my backyard is mostly fruit trees. I love citrus. Now, currently, everyone needs to also take, I'm a plant pathologist. I got my graduate work in plant pathology. And I worked on citrus at UC Riverside in John Mingy's lab. Currently, we have a disease of citrus called citrus greening. It's fatal disease of citrus. It is now established in the San Gabriel Valley, especially in San Gabriel, where they had hundreds of trees test positive. All those trees have to be cut down and destroyed as soon as they're identified as infected. So this started, it started a long time ago the disease occurs in China. Then it was found in Brazil. Then in 2007, they got the vector in Florida. By 2003, they had infected trees. They've lost over 250,000 acres of citrus in Florida to citrus greening. It's also called HLB, or Wang Wang Bing, which means China, the yellow dragon disease, the golden dragon disease. And so right now, if you go to a nursery in Pasadena, a Home Depot or a Lowe's or whatever, and go to get a citrus, it won't be there because there's a federal quarantine against selling citrus within the disease quarantine. The disease quarantine starts on the western edge of Pasadena, includes a little Highland Park and Eagle Rock, sweeps across Pasadena, goes down all the way to Whittier, down into Orange County. It's a large area, and within that disease quarantine, You cannot sell citrus out of a nursery. Now, Altadena currently, I don't think, is in the quarantine zone because there haven't been any infected trees up in that area yet. You can go outside the quarantine zone and buy a citrus and bring it back into the quarantine zone. That's not a problem. You're not supposed to take any plant parts, citrus plant parts out of the quarantine zone. That's nearly impossible to enforce because people trim their trees and put it in the trash, and the trash can pick it up and they drive it out of the quarantine zone. That was a big issue for us at the Ag Commissioner's office about how do we enforce these quarantines. There is a second quarantine, and you will notice this. When you go, if you're outside the quarantine zone, you're in Santa Monica, you're somewhere else, in Los Angeles, which is not in the quarantine zone, and you go to a nursery and they have citrus, there'll be a little yellow tag on the citrus. They're treating that citrus in nursery production every 3 months with a systemic insecticide to keep the vector off, which is called Asian citrus psyllid, ACP. So you'll see that. Now it's perfectly okay. You can buy that, bring it back, plant it in your yard, but I just don't know how long I still would do that. Now I lost my my orange tree to oak root rot fungus, which is common and widespread in the Central Valley. And I planted in plum and plum-cot and peach and nectarine and avocado. But fruit trees are great. There's just so many things to pick from. Pomegranates are kind of a hot new choice. I'm not a big fan of guavas, but they're nice trees. I still like all the stone fruits, peaches, nectarines, plums. Even though the plums are a good host for storage, remember that the stone fruits are not long-lived trees. 15, 20 years, and after that, their yield just crashes. So you don't find any old established peach orchards that are 30 years old. The yield is so low, it's not profitable. They get ripped out. So don't expect citrus, avocado, yeah, you grow those for 100 years. So I like avocado, I like citrus, I like pomegranate. Give them the space they need. They need about 15 feet apart. Lemons are good. And of course, what's always a good idea is maybe if you're into citrus, is getting a citrus that's multiple grafted. Because you can have orange, lemon, lime all on one tree. And that is, especially if you're pressed for space, or get maybe some of the dwarfs or semi-dwarfs. But now, you're going to take care of your fruit trees a lot different than you take care of a shade tree. You've got to, they get fertilized 3 times a year, spring, summer, fall. You push your yield. You want to get fruit. You want to get big fruit. And they take you got to keep the bugs off them. So in the spring, your citrus, you can spray with soaps and oils in the spring to keep the aphids and mealybug and scale and whitefly off of it. Now those are organic, they're non-toxic to humans, so you can control these pests with very low toxicity, organically registered pesticides. So depending on the fruit tree, you really need to investigate the pest problems with that fruit tree and what you're going to deal with. And in general, fruit trees are a little more work, actually a lot more work than a typical tree. Every spring, every winter, you're going to prune your stone fruits, the peaches, nectarines, plum. You're going to prune them hard, take out 2/3 of the wood. It spurs fast new growth. That flowers more, you get more yield. So fruit trees tend to be hard pruned in the winter, not the evergreen fruit trees, not citrus and avocado, but the deciduous fruit trees, apples, pears, all that kind of stuff. Up there in Altadena, you're probably still getting a little colder at night, so that's going to help you with a lot of these stone fruits that you have to pick, or apples and pears because they have to get their winter chill. Citrus and avocado do need the winter chill. But I love fruit trees, and that's my whole backyard is just vegetables and fruit trees.
So Jerry, we have a question in the chat from Cuba regarding how far away trees have to be from sewer lines, driveways, etc. Are those distances from the trunk or from the edge of the canopy?
The trunk. You're really looking at the trunk. The canopy can easily extend out, beyond these setbacks. That's not the problem. The problem is having a 50-foot tree that's only 10 feet from your house. And I've even seen them planted so close to the trunk it's pressing up against the house. So depending on what kind of home you have, whether you're on a perimeter foundation or a slab, there is potential to have damage from the roots. And the most common thing is getting into your sewer lines, clogging your sewer lines. You're constantly having something come out and clear your sewer line. And of course, on pavement, you know, getting under the pavement and lifting it and cracking it, and then you're dealing with that. So no, it's really from the trunk, not from the dripping.
Okay, we have a question, a raised hand from Vivian Fortunaso. Vivian, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I've been considering an Arbutus marina. What do you think about that tree? It's a strawberry tree.
I love Arbutus marina, and I also like Arbutus unido. You know, marina has the stringy bark, really nice. You know, about 15 to 20 feet is typical, real thick canopy, nice red fruit, very showy. No, they're very popular right now and easily available. I've only once seen them have a problem with root rot, but they were getting watered constantly.
Okay.
You know, a lot of people don't know how to water. Maybe I should briefly say you water landscapes by the inch, just the way you measure rainfall. And so when you water a tree, you give it a deep soak. The goal is to soak the root zone. That's 2 to 3 feet. Then you let it dry out for 2 to 4 weeks. You don't water trees every other day or multiple times during the week. That's when you run into root disease problems.
Right. Okay.
So, no, I love Arbutus. Nice tree, wonderful tree, and easily available.
Okay. Thank you.
Really important that you can actually go out and buy the tree you want.
Yes.
Okay, Jerry, we have another question in the chat from Catherine Gabsey. For Altadena, is Cercis occidentalis preferable to Cercis Canadensis?
I don't, you know, it'd just be a personal choice which one you like a little more. If you really are committed to natives, you'd go with the Western red bud. If you just think the Eastern red bud is a nicer tree, then you might go with that. I wouldn't, that's a personal choice in a way. Either tree is adequate. For native people, they would go with the Western red bud.
Okay, thanks. So Ken Y, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Up here in Altadena, we have a lot of trouble with very high winds. What is the consideration when you're picking a tree for one that's tolerant to high winds? That's where I've lost most of my trees. They blow over.
Well, high wind events are critical to tree care. And a lot of what we do to take care of trees is in reference to when those high winds are going to come. So your whole tree blew over? The roots came up and everything? Did it break off? Was there decay? I mean,
well, we've various things. This last time a whole oak tree blew over, and we've lost pepper trees. Tall pepper trees have blown over as well, but then branches keep blowing off and coming down on various of our trees. And so, are they wind intolerant trees?
Exposed? Do you have a higher exposure to wind than others?
Oh, we have a lot of trees around the house and on the property. It's an acre property, and there's lots of large trees on it.
Well, over the years, what I've observed with the high wind events is that, you know, what do you see get blown over on a regular basis when we get the high wind events? Eucalyptus and oaks are the most common trees to blow over in the wind, in my experience. Now, if you lost your oak, there's a good chance that it had oak root rot fungus and that the roots were rotted. Did it lift up the soil or did it break off?
It kind of lifted up a little bit, but mostly broke off. You know, in other words,
I suspect you had decay in
all the roots didn't come out. Okay.
Now, when I was at the Huntington, and I believe it was 97, we had that huge wind event, and in one night we lost 100 trees. And I know because I was tasked with going out and counting them and coming up with a report. And we lost an Italian stone pine with a 4-foot trunk and 110 feet tall. We lost eucalyptus trees snapped in half at about 30 feet. They had big decay pockets. Wind is always a really critical issue. So big trees, you know, 50-footers, those are the ones that are more likely to blow over. small trees in the 20 to 30 foot range, very rarely blow over. Thinner canopies, I've never seen a Eucalyptus citradora blow over. I did see one fall over because it had a lot of decay, but that's a thin, wispy tree. So Agonis flexuosa, I doubt if it would ever blow over because it's so thin and wispy. So that could be an important consideration. I would stay away from any of the big, heavy eucalyptus trees for sure. Some of them are, you know, boy, that blue gum is just notorious for coming down. But no one plants them anymore, and no one grows them anymore. They're not good trees for suburban areas. They were used mostly as windbreaks in the early, you know, when people were, you know, coming to California, and it was mostly agriculture. But now the other thing is correct pruning as the tree is growing to avoid structural default or structural fault that then lend themselves to damage during high winds. So you don't want codominant leaders with narrow crotches. When the tree is growing, you pick one central leader. Your scaffolds start at around 10 to 12 feet. They're vertically and horizontally distributed so they don't overlap. You don't want big, huge scaffolds. Generally, the rule of thumb is the scaffold should be 1/3 the size of the trunk. So if you've got a 3-foot trunk, your scaffold should not be bigger than 1 foot. When you have large scaffolds, you know, say you got a 3-foot trunk and a 2.5-foot scaffold. You see that on some of the ficus all the time. Those large scaffold branches have a tendency to rip and fall off. And when do they happen? In a high wind event. So pruning your tree, and then in the fall, you can thin your tree. Now I've heard some people say, "Oh, don't do that." Come on, it's a sale. If you can thin out that tree a little bit, you'll reduce the damage. Now don't top your trees. Don't severely prune the trees. The severely pruned trees that were topped, and then from that big cut wound, that 5-6 inch branch that was just cut, all the sprouts break, all the dormant buds along the edge break and start growing. Those are very weakly attached to the trunk, and now they're real candidates to be ripped off in a windstorm. So they grow fast, they grow like independent trees. You come back in 2 or 3 years, you've got 3-inch a branch that's just attached on the edge of that cut branch, and then when the wind blows, it's going to come off fairly easily. So proper pruning will help you deal with high wind events, but to some extent, when the wind really blows, if you're talking about an 80-mile-an-hour wind, there aren't any trees that can resist 80 hurricane-force winds. The only way you're going to really avoid that is not having any really big trees on the property.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just thinking.
Okay, so, and then of course, if you're talking about you're planting a new oak or you're planting something that's going to get big, don't have a lawn underneath it. You got to water it that first year once a week, but once it's established, 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years down the road, you really got to go on our native oaks to only watering during the winter and spring, especially in drought years. So our oaks are supposed to go dormant in the summer. So you shouldn't have coast live oaks or any of our native oaks with a huge garden planted underneath them. It should be oak compatible plants, and you can find a good list on the California Oak Foundation website. You can find a good list in the Western Sunset book. These are plants that are shade and drought tolerant, Oregon grade, and some of our native, actually one of the great ones would be poison oak, but of course no one's going to plant that. But and then you don't have a thick garden underneath them. You spot a few plants underneath them, and you're going to individually water those plants with a hose every couple of weeks. But the big disaster is putting a lawn under your native oak and watering it 2 or 3 times a week, especially an old established native oak, and you come in and change that environment. And then after about 5 years, you look up and it's thinning, it's not getting new growth. And because warm, wet soil favors armillaria. So cold, wet soils don't seem to be that bad for it. So don't water your native oaks. And then they're far less likely to blow over in a windstorm if you can keep that oak root rot fungus under control through your irrigation practices.
Thanks, Jerry. Kim Yuba, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi.
Hi.
Speaking of wind, on New Year's Eve this last year, we had our neighbor's coastal oak fall on our garage and our car and crushed them to death. But when you're talking about the rotting, it just snapped off, and there was termite and other rot going on at the base of the tree. And it was really sad to see it fall down, but it was obviously very, very old. But I had a question. Sorry?
Go ahead with your question.
Oh, I had a question about the best tree for the lawn. I made a note that the sawleaf Zelkova is good to plant in a lawn area, and also
That's what you find in a lawn.
Would a strawberry tree do well in a lawn too?
I would probably have a circle around it about 5 feet in radius, where there's no turf, and try and direct the sprinkler system away, not water directly underneath the tree.
Okay.
Some people have these big trees, they're in their lawn. You cut a big circle around it. If you have an old-fashioned sprinkler system with pop-up heads all over the place, then you just unscrew that head, or take out the nozzle and put in a half circle, so it doesn't, not a full circle that's watering under the tree. So it's just, and then try and keep a dry area under that. I'd have to go back and see if that has. I have not seen the arbutus get oak root rot. That doesn't mean they don't get it. It's just not something I've seen. But generally speaking, you don't want those trees to be wet all the time. So you need to have a circle around them that's kept on the dry side. And then about, of course, once a week for the first year, you got to water it. And then after a few years, you can start just watering it once a month or every couple of weeks.
Okay.
The things that I've seen do really well in lawns are magnolias, Magnolia grandiflora, Magnolia slanigana. But you often end up with a lot of surface rooting, because the roots proliferate wherever the soil is moist. And if you're constantly wetting the 6 inches, top 6 or 12 inches, that's where all your roots are going to be.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the one kind of caveat when growing trees in lawns is you tend to get a lot of surface rooting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jerry. We have a question in the chat from the chair. You have mentioned many trees that need cool temperatures in the winter. With climate change, the cooler temps are now warmer. Does that affect the tree choice?
Well, what I was referring to on the fruit trees is called vernalization, where they have to get a winter chill in order to go dormant and flower in the spring. Typically, anything, and it's given in hours below 45 degrees, although it's not chiseled in stone. It's kind of fuzzy. So basically, if you wanted to grow a peach tree or a nectarine or a plum, you wanted to get something that required 500 hours or less. Well, we are getting warmer, and a lot of those trees that would have done fine at 500 hours are not flowering as well, and it's actually affecting the Central Valley with all the stone fruit growers up there. There are old varieties that probably required 600, 700, 800 hours are not flowering, and their yields are way down because our winters aren't cold. When I grew up here and I was mowing lawns in the late 60s and early 70s, with a little gardening route, going to PCC, no one grew plumeria. No one. It wouldn't make it one winter. It would freeze and be dead. Bam. Now everyone grows plumeria, including me. I've got a dozen of them in my backyard. So we are warmer. If you're going to choose fruit trees, you're going to want to get those with a lower chill requirement, maybe in the 300-hour range. There are some great apples, Anna, Gordon, Beverly Hills that only need 250, 300 hours of chill. In Altadena, boy, in the old days, I'd say, oh, well, why don't you go for the higher chill? Go for something that needs 600 or 700 hours. You're in Altadena, you get colder than where I live down in the valley part. But now I would tend to go for that. Now, in terms of just shade trees, I don't know that that's really going to have a dramatic effect, that we're not as cold in the winter. But you should always, we've all got to think of climate change because we are getting warmer. I think the most important thing you're going to want to pick are drought-tolerant trees because we're just not going to get as much rain as we've had in the past. And we have to bring a lot of water from the north. And the water problem is just so big that drought tolerance is probably your number one kind of thing to think about when it comes to tree selection and climate.
Great. So somebody, thanks, Jerry. Somebody asked, this is another question from the chair, should we water mature oak trees during the summer months? For example, we get temperatures many days now over 100 degrees. Is that stressing the oak trees at all, or other trees?
No, I would not water. The only caveat I'm going to give you is for Engelmann oak. But in general, no, do not water your oak trees during the summer. You can water them in the winter, in the spring, especially if it doesn't. This is what I always say. If it didn't rain in December, water the first week of January. If it doesn't rain in January, water the first week of February. And if we have a really dry year, like downtown gets 5 inches, Pasadena might get less than 10, and our average should be like 22. Then you can go ahead and water in March and April, maybe May, but it's once a month. You put out a sprinkler. You're going to want to put down 4 inches of water. You can put out a coffee cup or any straight-sided cup. You run the sprinkler until you have 4 inches of water in the cup. Now, if you have to take into a lot of things into consideration. If you got a slope, then you're going to need to maybe use a soaker hose rather than a sprinkler. You don't want runoff. But if it's flat and you can put out a sprinkler and use the coffee cup, you can do that for your lawn as well. Lawns require about a ½ inch every time you water them. So you put out a coffee cup, you run your sprinklers, and figure out how many inches per hour you're applying, or just wait until you've got a ½ inch. That's enough. But no, don't water your oaks in the summer. They can tolerate the severe heat pretty fine. In fact, when we've had some of our extreme heat, a few years back, it hit 122 at the Huntington. And then just a few weeks ago, it hit 112 here in South Pasadena. None of the oaks burned. All the avocados were brown and to a crisp, but the oaks were good. The Chinese mole, which is pepper trees, they didn't burn. The eucalyptus trees didn't burn. But no, don't water your oaks. Now, I mentioned the caveat. In the Sunset Western Garden book, it says that Engelmann oaks show improvement with summer irrigation. And they started doing a little summer irrigation at the Arboretum. It was a little controversial. Some people said, oh, you shouldn't water those oaks at all. You don't really need to do that if you watered them real good in February, March, and April. They got 4 or 5 months with a good soak in the spring. You still shouldn't need to water them in the summer. Or they go dormant. They're summer dormant. So they really don't need that water. Avoid watering your oaks in the summer, especially.
So the chair of Altadena Heritage asks, I see a lot of trees with big stones around the trunk. Is that a good idea?
That's fine. That won't damage the tree at all. It's decorative. A lot of times people want, well, if I don't grow anything under my oak tree, what do I want it to look nicer. So yeah, people put royal rock. You can leave it natural with just leaf. But the rock is fine. It's not going to adversely affect the trunk. It's quite common and it looks nice. So no problem with that. I wouldn't have them right up against the trunk though. I'd probably have a foot or two away from the trunk where there's absolutely nothing.
Okay, so you raised the question of leaves under the oak trees. I see many properties with all the leaves swept up, blown away by the leaf blower guy. And so the ground under oak trees and deodars is swept clean. Is that a good practice for oaks?
You want a nice litter layer underneath the trees. If there's no, it just depends on what's under there. If it's, sometimes you'll have patio, and so that doesn't apply. But no, if you've got just soil, let the leaves accumulate, especially on things like avocado, for the oaks. Having that thick litter layer is very beneficial for the trees.
Right. Okay. We have Kim Yuba has her hand still raised. Did you have another question, Kim?
Hi, thank you so much. I actually haven't asked a question yet, so I have a few questions. So I'll just start with, I really love clumping bamboo as a screen. So what do you think about, I know there's bamboo tends to be invasive, but do you have an opinion on clumping bamboo?
The clumping bamboo should be fine. The invasive bamboos are the runners, like golden bamboo, which, got planted in my backyard. And now I'm running around 20 feet away, cutting shoots coming up everywhere. So, stay away from the runners. The clumping bamboos are fine. They're not invasive. There's a lot of interesting species available. I don't know if you have space for the giant bamboo, which is big, huge canes. And then there's one with a very fine cut texture. I forget the species. But yeah, clumping bamboos are excellent and they make very good screens.
So I would need kind of a narrow growing clumping bamboo, and it's growing under power lines too. So
well, then you're gonna have to pick one that doesn't. Then the giant bamboo's out.
Okay. Okay.
But there are others that don't get as tall. I'm not really an expert on the bamboos, but they've got nice. Probably, I'm thinking that the Huntington has a very nice collection of bamboos, and I think the Bamboo Society meets at the Huntington. And if you did a search on Google or any search engine, you could go in and look at a lot of the bamboos. Go to the Sunset Western Garden book and look up their section on bamboo, and find one that fits your needs on height and the look you want, and then see if you can find it. You may need to maybe contact some people in the bamboo group to see where you can find it if you pick something unusual. It's funny, the runners are the golden bamboo is easily available, but I don't think anyone should ever plant it.
Right, because it'll grow into my neighbor's yard probably.
Oh, it'll go up 50 feet away.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually getting ready to tear out a huge clump of it because it just keeps coming up everywhere. The runners are not a good idea in my opinion. I don't, the bamboo people love them all, but
yeah.
I'd stay away from the runners, and some of the clumpers are, I think Bambusa nigra, the black bamboo, that would be a nice one. It's unusual look to it with the black cane.
Yeah.
I think I'd have to go back and see if that's a runner or not. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Just to clarify, you had said something about not growing crepe myrtles. So what, is that right? Did I hear you say that? Don't plant.
Crepe myrtle is a host for bacterial leaf spores, and once infected, they'll die. So that the trees that get bacterial leaf spores are liquid amber, olive, crepe myrtle, and plum, and then oleander is the shrub. So I would not plant any of those currently in Southern California.
Okay. Just planted one like 2 years ago in my lawn.
Well, I wouldn't tear it out.
Yeah, and it's in our lawn. Okay.
So as I drive around Southern California, I see, I'm constantly looking at the trees and everything. A couple years ago, I was going down the 5 down to the beach, and I'm going along, and there's just rows of dead crepe myrtles. So I come to a row, about 10 dead crepe myrtles, and I go another quarter mile, half mile, another row of dead crepe myrtles. And that's all leaf spores killing them. But up here in the San Gabriel Valley, I don't see it killing them. Like, go look at the liquid ambers. They're dying everywhere from spores. They're on Huntington, where it meets, Fair Oaks and Huntington in South Pass. A huge center median was all liquid ambers. They're all gone. They've all been cut down. And the city replaced them with crepe myrtle.
Oh.
Now, but they might maybe they won't get infected for 10, 20, 30 years. You can hope. It's vectored by a small insect. So there's really no way to keep it off or keep it out. Once infected, they tend to die within about 5 years, 6, 7 years. But for the crepe myrtles, I don't see them crashing and dying as much in the San Gabriel Valley as I see them out in Riverside County or down in Orange County.
Yeah.
But the freeway plays a funny role with this because they see the hosts that are grown along the freeway tend to get really trashed by it, die quickly. So it may be the heat from the pavement, because this is a water availability issue. Broad sense. The bacteria lives inside the xylem, the water conducting tissue. It clogs it up. The tree can't get the water from the roots up into the shoots, and you get very similar symptoms to drought stress. The edges of the leaves turn brown, the tree wilts, branches die. After about 5 years, the whole tree dies. So no, I wouldn't plant any more crepe myrtles, but I see them all over the place, and And South Pass has planted a lot of them. They've been in the ground 5, even 10 years, and they're still not infected. So that's, diseases are not uniform. They don't kill every tree all at once. It takes a long time for it to spread and kill trees. If you love a tree and you're willing to take the risk, go for it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jerry. One last question. Is there a certain time of year we should prune our avocado tree?
Yes, the fall and the winters. Be very careful with avocados, pruning your avocados. Avocados are super sensitive to full sun on their bark, and more sensitive than probably anything else. And so if you open up the canopy to full sun right before the summer heat, you're going to fry your branches. The tops of your branches will be all burnt. Then that bark will slough away, and you'll have a big open wound, and that usually gets infected with a fungus, and you have a canker. You can see a lot of old avocados around town with the tops of the branches burnt or the trunk burnt. You know, so be very careful. They're usually pruned in late fall, in the winter. And then, of course, you're going to want to fertilize your avocado 3 times a year. And I love them. They're great. Fuerte is my favorite, but I need to get a Haas in too. So I'll have a summer avocado. They require a lot of water. They use a lot more water than any other fruit tree. They are tropical. They're more tender than all of our other fruit trees. They will freeze in a hard freeze. Other than that, yeah, just prune them in the winter and you should be okay. And very carefully prune them, you know, thin them out, but don't open them up to too much full sun.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. And thank you everyone who's attending. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you at our next workshop, October 24th. That'll be Jerry telling us about pruning and tree care, and that's a very important workshop. Thanks, Jerry. This was just great. Thank you.